Machiavelli's political ontology. I want to start not with Machiavelli himself, but with Gramsci's remarks on Machiavelli from the prison notebooks in a section of what in the English selections from the prison notebooks is called The Modern Prince, a section entitled Prediction and Perspective, which is perhaps the most interesting section from a philosophical point of view. And there, Gramsci deals with Machiavelli's notion of effective reality and the difference between what is and what ought to be. This is Machiavelli's idea that the prince and thus everybody, in order to be successful and avoid destruction and ruin, should focus on what is rather than on what ought to be. One should focus on effective reality, la verità effettuale della cosa. This is usually understood as Machiavelli's political realism. In The Prince, the idea of effective reality is perhaps the most important. It is the idea whereby Machiavelli is usually seen as a political scientist, the thinker who opens the way to the autonomy of the political. Certainly, the thinker who sharply distinguishes between politics and ethics, and at first sight, one who has no concern for political ontology, but only looks at what is there, the political given, and offers a description or an anatomy of it. And he offers a prescription only insofar as the prince must follow the dictates of the real, effective reality and of what is. In truth, things stand very differently, and Gramsci shows that very well. Effective reality includes possibility, potentiality, and contingency. What is also what could be. The passage to which Gramsci refers in his note on Machiavelli, I mentioned above, is from chapter 15 of The Prince. It is a famous chapter. Which I quote at length, in which Machiavelli says, I'm quoting, but my hope is to write a book that will be useful, at least to those who read it intelligently. And so I thought it's sensible to go straight to a discussion of how things are in real life, verità effettuale della cosa, and not waste time with a discussion of an imaginary world. For many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could, for the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an idea will soon discover he has been taught how to destroy himself, not how to preserve himself. End quote. Machiavelli is speaking against the imaginary and ideal, something like the utopia that Thomas More will soon publish in the year 1516. But what is his view about the concrete possibility contained in what already is? For Gramsci, the political realism, so-called, contained in this passage as well as in The Prince as a whole, should not make us think of Machiavelli as someone who is merely interested in what is there, effective reality, understood as excluding potentiality. The opposite is the case. The potential and possible are equally constitutive elements of effective reality, of how things are in real life, according to the translation I used. Indeed, in real life, things might not be what they ought to be, but their being opens up to and includes what could be. What is important is that the possible be understood in its concrete and material reality. For Gramsci, Machiavelli is not a diplomat or a mere scientist who has to keep within the limits of effective reality, understood as what is merely visible and tangible, what is there in front of us and limits us. Indeed, Machiavelli is a poet. Gramsci doesn't use this word, but he uses the word creator, which in this sense, a Vickian sense, if you will, is the same. Gramsci begins by saying, I'm quoting, but Machiavelli is not merely a scientist, he is a partisan, a man of powerful passions, an active politician who wishes to create a new balance of forces and therefore cannot help concerning himself with what ought to be, not of course in a moralistic sense. End quote. Soon, Gramsci will clearly say that there are two concepts of what ought to be. Machiavelli is, of course, not interested in the moralistic concept. So, in what way does he concern himself with it? In other words, what is the concept of what ought to be that Machiavelli is interested in? Gramsci does not say. He doesn't use the word ontological and ethical, which I want to call attention to. He does say, however, that what ought to be, the concept of what ought to be with which Machiavelli concerns himself, despite the passage I read from chapter 15 of The Prince, in which he says that the ruler must look at what is. This concept, Gramsci stresses, has a political, historical, realistic, and concrete dimension. Obviously, Gramsci is right. This is indeed what interests Machiavelli. Certainly not an unreal and fantastic situation which is not, but moralistically ought to be. Yet, insofar as this is true, Machiavelli is really concerned with political ontology, and that is to say, the constitution of the political and social world, and thus with ethics. Ethics, not moralistic thinking, to be sure, and Gramsci is absolutely correct in this as well. Why ethics? Because what ought to be is, as Gramsci says, quoting, concrete will. And the will transports the whole discussion to the plane of ethics, and in particular the plane of contingency, namely of what can be and also not be. So, more than speaking of two concepts of what ought to be, it would be better to distinguish between what ought to be and what could be. Machiavelli knows very well that the latter, that is to say, what could be, the possible and potential, is part of effective reality properly understood. It is part of what is. It is a concrete tendency within that reality, one that could unfold and develop, though it could also not do so. Indeed, there is no intrinsic necessity that it should, no certainty that it will, but there is concrete clarity as to the facts that it could, that in other words, there is an alternative. Gramsci says, and I'm quoting, Machiavelli bases himself on effective reality. But what is this effective reality? End quote. And this is Gramsci's own question. Gramsci's answer, in the form of a further question, a rhetorical question, points to potentiality. He asks, and I'm quoting, is it effective reality? something static and immobile, or is it not rather a relation of forces in continuous motion and shift of equilibrium? End quote. Obviously, the latter is the case. Thus, effective reality, what is, includes the will to creation, and I'm quoting, the will to the creation of a new equilibrium on the basis of tendencies and forces present and operative in the all one. Effective reality, what is, includes becoming or coming to be. When one is involved in the effort of creation in this way, according to Gramsci, I'm quoting, one still moves on the terrain of effective reality, but does so in order to dominate and transcend it or contribute to this. End quote. At this point, Gramsci can highlight the fundamental aspect of Machiavelli's political ontology, which are, interestingly, based on what at first sight Machiavelli seems to reject: the dimension or modality of what ought to be, the potential, and again, I want to add, ethical. Thus, Gramsci says, I'm quoting, what ought to be is therefore concrete. Indeed, it is the only realistic and historicist interpretation of reality. It alone is history in the making and philosophy in the making. It alone is politics. Becoming, potentiality, possibility, we all recognize these concepts in the passage by Gramsci I just read. A full ontology of contingency of what can be and not be, and thus a full theory of ethics, the practical science of freedom, part of political science, as Aristotle holds. I have already said how there are for Gramsci, quoting again, two concepts of what ought to be: the abstract and phantasmagorical concept of Savonarola, the prophetic and moralistic friar who denounces all corruption, and the realistic concept of Machiavelli, realistic even if it did not in fact become direct reality, since one cannot expect an individual or a book to change reality, but only to interpret it and to indicate the possible lines of action. End quote. I have also said how I prefer the modality of what could be to that of what ought to be, when speaking of Machiavelli, but also in general. And I would venture to say that this is indeed what Gramsci also means, what he is talking about. Interestingly, he says that perhaps this realistic ought to be will not become direct reality. Isn't Gramsci saying, and of course I am here thinking about and applying categories typically employed by Giorgio Agamben, so isn't Gramsci saying that there is a possibility that such a potentiality will not pass into actuality? In other words, isn't Gramsci speaking about contingency, namely the full formula of freedom, which includes potentiality and the potentiality not to? Isn't he speaking ontologically, politically, and ethically, addressing that which can be and not be, addressing, that is to say, the dynamic interplay of fortune and virtue in the constitution of political reality? What is certain is that Machiavelli's project is realistic and historical, historicist, says Gramsci, precisely because reality is not, by him, reduced to what merely is, the merely given, but it essentially includes what can be. what could be. At this point, I would like to insert in my discussion one more extremely important moment in Machiavelli's political ontology. This is intimately related to the idea of effective reality, of what is, and points to the freedom of potentiality, of what could be, which as always implies the potentiality not to what could also not be. I am referring to a passage from chapter 9 of The Prince, where Machiavelli says that, I'm quoting, in every city one finds two opposed classes, the people and the elite. End quote. He continues saying that these two classes, quoting again, are at odds because the people do not want to be dominated or oppressed by the elites, and the elites want to dominate and oppress the people. End quote. After dismissing the possibility of a healthy alliance, of a healthy alliance with the elites who are difficult to please, Machiavelli shows his true political stance when he says that the prince must rely on the people, and I'm quoting again, for the objectives of the people are less immoral than those of the elite, for the latter want to oppress, and the former not to be oppressed. This thought is so important that it is also found in Machiavelli's discourses, right? The discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livius. There, in chapter 5 of book 1, Machiavelli says, I'm quoting, and doubtless, if we consider the objectives of the noble, or the elite, and of the people, we must see that the first have a great desire to dominate, while the latter have only the wish not to be dominated, and consequently a greater desire to live in the enjoyment of freedom. End quote. Freedom is then the measure for Machiavelli. It is what motivates his writing, and it is the very realistic alternative to the system of domination that disfigures reality in the closedness of what merely is. Yet, freedom is already there, present in what is, as its potentiality and concrete possibility, as its flight and exits. It is the ontological and ethical grounding of another and better world. But who desires freedom? And who is therefore closest to it? Machiavelli is here very clear, the people, he says, because they reject domination as such. They simply want not to be dominated and oppressed. Speaking of the modern prince, which cannot be a real person, a concrete individual, but an organism, the party. I'm quoting, a complex element of society in which a collective will begins to take concrete form, end quote. Gramsci says that what is at stake, in addition to an economic reform, is also, quoting, an intellectual and moral reform, end quote. He says, quoting again, in men's consciences, the prince takes the place of divinity, or the categorical imperative, and becomes the basis for a modern laicism and for a complete laicization or secularization of all aspects of life and of all customary relationships, end quote. A complete remake of the world, closer to the earthliness of thought, as is clear from the following important passage that I'm going to read, which is my favorite Gramsci quote from his discussion of Marxism or the philosophy of praxis. And here Gramsci says, the philosophy of praxis is absolute historicism, the absolute secularization and earthliness of thoughts, an absolute humanism of history, end quote. The modern prince, then, has a new ontological, political, and ethical perspective on life, a myth, an earthly and poetic figure expressing the science of freedom and happiness, pointing to the good life that must be built.